I didn't even look at her face. Maren Holloway had traveled 600 miles on a rattling train with one worn trunk, two folded letters, and the fragile belief that a man named Warren Holt had meant every word he wrote. She stepped onto that platform in the dust and wind of Caldwell, Kansas, with her chin up and her hands trembling, searching for the face she'd only seen in a photograph. She found him. He was standing 30 feet away, and he was already looking at someone else. Warren Holt took one long look at Maren, turned his back without speaking a single word, and walked straight toward a woman in a yellow dress who had stepped off the same train. He took that woman's bag. He offered his arm. He smiled. And Maren stood there in the open air of that platform, in front of every soul in Caldwell, with her trunk at her feet and nowhere on earth to go. If that were you, standing in a strange town, with no money, no family, and the man who promised to marry you walking away without even saying your name, what would you do? Stay with us, because what happened next changed everything. Before we go further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning Maren Holloway left Mill Haven, Ohio, her landlady stood in the doorway of the boarding house and said nothing. Not good luck, not farewell, not even a simple nod. She just watched Maren carry her trunk down 3 porch steps alone and disappear around the corner toward the depot. And when Maren glanced back once, just once, the woman had already gone inside and shut the door. That was the kind of woman Maren had always been. The kind people didn't bother watching leave. She was 31 years old, which in 1887 meant most people in Mill Haven had stopped expecting anything interesting to happen to her. She had a wide, plain face, dark eyes set close together, and a nose that her mother had once described as honest, at least. Her hands were calloused from 6 years of taking in mending and ironing. Her coat was clean but thin. She owned 3 dresses, 2 dark, one the color of old bread, and a pair of boots she had resold twice with money she'd set aside from Christmas orders. She was not remarkable to look at. She knew this. But she could read. She could write a letter worth reading. And when Warren Holt's advertisement had appeared in the Ladies' Pioneer Gazette 16 months ago, rancher, widower, 2 children, seeks honest woman of steady character for frontier companionship and matrimony, correspondents welcomed. Maren had sat down at the small desk in her rented room and written him the most honest letter she had ever written anyone. She didn't pretend to be young or beautiful. She didn't claim skills she didn't have. She told him she was plain, practical, and tired of the narrow life she was living. She told him she had never been loved by a man, but she believed she was capable of it. She sealed the envelope and mailed it before she could lose her nerve, and then she didn't sleep properly for 8 days. His reply came on a Tuesday. She read it 4 times, standing at the mail window, and twice more walking home. Warren Holt had neat handwriting and a straightforward way of speaking through paper that she liked immediately. He said her letter was the only one he'd received that didn't try to sell him something. He said he had a cattle operation outside Caldwell, Kansas, that he'd built from next to nothing, and that he needed a woman with a spine more than he needed a woman with a dowry. He asked her to write again. She wrote again. 16 months of letters, every 2 weeks, then every week, then sometimes twice a week. He told her about the ranch, the size of it, the hard winters, the dry summers, the cattle prices that could make a man rich or ruin him in the same season. He told her about his daughters, Lily and Clara, who were 6 years old and had their mother's stubbornness and their father's habit of going quiet when something was wrong. He told her his wife Dora had died of a fever 3 winters past, and that the girls still sometimes set a place for her at the table. Maren told him about Mill Haven, about the boarding house, the mending work, the Sunday mornings that were the loneliest hours of her week. She told him about her father, who had died when she was 12, and her mother, who had remarried a man who didn't want another man's daughter underfoot. She told Warren things she had never said aloud to any person living, and somehow that felt safer than she expected, the way confessing to paper never bounced back and hit you the way words could. By the time he wrote asking her to come to Caldwell, she had already been ready for 3 months. She sold the small things she'd accumulated. She gave notice to her landlady. She packed her trunk with the care of someone who understood that everything in it might need to last a long time. And on the morning she left, she let herself feel, just briefly, something she hadn't felt since childhood. Hope. Fragile, ridiculous, stubborn hope. The train ride was 31 hours with 2 connections. Marin sat upright in the passenger car and watched the country flatten and widen as Ohio gave way to Indiana, Indiana to Illinois, Illinois to the great blown-open nothing of the Kansas plains. She had never been west before. The land unsettled her. Too much sky, too little to catch the eye. But she told herself that was just unfamiliarity. Everything unfamiliar felt like danger at first. She arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in early October. The platform was busy with a train that had pulled in at the same time from the south, and she stepped down into the mingling crowd carrying her small traveling bag, her trunk being offloaded by the porter. She straightened her coat. She put her chin up. She looked for Warren Holt. She found him in 30 seconds. He looked like his photograph, more or less. Broad through the shoulders, close-cut dark beard, wearing a hat that had been broken in for years. He was taller than she'd imagined. He was standing at the edge of the platform, looking at the passengers coming off the southbound train, and there was something in his expression she couldn't read from 30 feet away. She raised her hand to signal him. He didn't see her, or if he did, he didn't react. She started toward him, weaving between people, her boot catching slightly on an uneven board. She steadied herself. She was 10 feet away when it happened. A woman came down the steps from the southbound car. Yellow dress, brown hair pinned up with a few deliberate curls left loose, the kind of face that made people step back slightly to give it more room. She was carrying a leather bag that cost more than Marin's entire trunk and everything in it. She looked around the platform with the easy expectation of a woman who had never once in her life had to wonder whether she would be noticed. Warren Holt's face changed. It was not a dramatic change, it was worse than dramatic. It was quiet, the way a man's expression goes when something clicks into place that he didn't know he was waiting for. He stepped forward. He reached out and took the woman's bag before she'd even looked in his direction. He said something. The woman laughed, one short, surprised sound, and took his offered arm. He had not looked at Marin once. Marin stopped walking. She stood 6 feet from Warren Holt and watched him lead that woman off the platform, and she understood, in the specific and total way that some understandings arrive, that he was not going to turn around. She waited anyway. For 3 full minutes, she waited, because she was the kind of person who needed to be completely, undeniably certain before she accepted something terrible. He did not turn around. The platform crowd thinned. The porters moved trunks. Somewhere nearby, a child was crying, and a man was calling out the name of the next station. Marin's trunk sat beside her. The October wind came across the open plains and hit her square in the chest. She did not cry. She had not cried in a very long time, and she was not going to start on a train platform in Kansas in front of strangers. She picked up her traveling bag. She stood very still and looked at the end of the platform where Warren Holt had disappeared with the woman in the yellow dress, and she did something she had become expert at over 31 years. She kept her face completely neutral. What she was feeling underneath that face was a different matter. It was a hot, nauseating thing. Not quite grief and not quite fury, but something that lived between them. The letters. 16 months of letters. She had told him things. She had trusted him with true things, and trust didn't come naturally to Marin Holloway. She'd had to work at it, had to push past every instinct that said people leave, people disappoint. Don't hand anyone a piece of yourself you can't get back. She'd done it anyway. And he had looked straight past her at a woman in a better dress. She became aware slowly that people were watching her, not with cruelty, mostly with the particular discomfort of strangers who've witnessed someone else's humiliation and don't know the polite way to look away. A woman near the station door said something quietly to her husband. 2 men at the far end of the platform had gone carefully still. Marin picked up her trunk handle. She needed to find out what this town had in the way of a hotel, and how much it cost, and how long her money would last. She had $11.40. She knew exactly how much everything in her bag had cost, and how many weeks of ironing each item represented. She took 1 step, and the trunk refused to move. She had jammed the handle trying to lift it one-handed, and the latch was stuck. She yanked at it, and it didn't give. She yanked harder. That latch sticks if you catch it sideways. The voice came from her left. She turned. The man standing there was not someone she had noticed before, which told her something. He was the kind of person who didn't announce himself. He was perhaps late 30s, weathered in the way that outdoor men get weathered, with lines around his eyes that came from sun and squinting rather than age. He was lean, but not thin. He had on a coat that had been good once and was still decent. He was looking at her trunk, not at her, and he reached down and did something quick with 2 fingers to the latch, and it released. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He stepped back. He looked at her then, briefly and directly. Not the way men sometimes looked at her face, and then looked away with a faint expression of having checked something off a list, but something more level than that. Something almost careful. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. He didn't argue with her. She appreciated that. He looked out toward the end of the platform where Warren Holt had gone. He looked back at her. She could see him understanding the situation the way people do when they're paying attention and the pieces aren't complicated. "Gideon Mercer," he said. He didn't offer his hand. He seemed to sense she was at her limit, and a handshake might push her over some edge she was working hard to stay back from. "Marin Holloway," she said. There was a pause. Not an awkward one, exactly. The wind came through again, and she braced against it. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. And she had never said anything more true in her life. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked down at the trunk. Then he looked back at the station building, as though he was working something out. "I've got a buckboard," he said. "I need to pick up feed, and I've got a couple hours before I head back to the ranch. There's a woman at the end of Main Street who takes in boarders. Clean place, reasonable. If you want, I can point you there." "I'm not looking for charity," she said. It came out faster than she intended. "I know," he said. "I'm just a man with a wagon offering to carry a trunk that weighs about as much as a dead cow. You can say no." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "I'll say yes." He nodded and picked up the trunk like it was nothing, which meant either he was stronger than he looked or she'd been overestimating its weight, and she followed him off the platform into the dirt and wind of Caldwell, Kansas. She found out later, from the woman at the boarding house, that Gideon Mercer had lost his wife 2.5 years ago and was raising twin girls alone on a cattle ranch 6 miles outside of town. She found out that most people considered him a decent man and a stubborn one, and that the ranch had been struggling since his wife died, not failing exactly, but tilting. She did not find out until the next morning what he was thinking when he came back to the boarding house and knocked on the door and took his hat off and said, carefully, that he'd been thinking about something since yesterday. She let him in. She sat across from him at the narrow table by the window. "I'm not going to talk around it," he said. "I've got 2 little girls who need more than I can give them. I've got a ranch that needs more hands than I can afford. I'm not in a position to offer much." "You haven't offered anything yet," she said. "I'm getting there." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm not asking you to marry me. That'd be a lunatic thing to say to a woman I met yesterday on a train platform. What I'm asking is whether you'd be willing to come out to the ranch, see it, meet the girls. Give it a week and see whether it's something you could stand." She looked at him. "And if I can't stand it? Then I bring you back and we part ways without either of us owing the other anything. And if I can?" He met her eyes. "Then we talk." Marin sat with that for a moment. Outside, someone was driving a cart past, and the horse's hooves were loud on the packed dirt of the street. She thought about $11.40. She thought about the boarding house woman who had already looked at her this morning with an expression that said she'd seen women in Marin's situation before and had opinions about where they tended to end up. She thought about the 600 miles of flatland she'd crossed to get here and the fact that she had nothing waiting for her in the direction she'd come from. She thought about Warren Holt and the woman in the yellow dress, and she made herself feel that fully for 3 seconds, the specific burning shame of being looked through. And then she set it down. She was not going to carry that around. She couldn't afford to. "When do we leave?" she said. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite. More like a small release of tension she hadn't known he was holding. "I'll have the buckboard ready at 7 tomorrow morning," he said. "If you change your mind before then, I won't hold it against you." "I won't change my mind," she said. He stood, put his hat back on, and went to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "Those letters," he said, "the ones you wrote to Holt, were they the truth?" She felt the question land somewhere unexpected. "Every word," she said. He nodded once. "Good," he said, and left. She sat at that table for a long time after he was gone. The window looked out on a street she didn't know, in a town she hadn't chosen, in a state she'd arrived in as a stranger. The morning sun was coming through at an angle that made the dust in the air visible, thousands of small particles moving in the light, going wherever the air took them. Maren Holloway was 31 years old, and she had $11.40, and she was about to drive 6 miles out into the Kansas frontier with a man she had known for less than 24 hours, to meet two small girls who had never asked for any of this, on the slimmest chance that something could be built from nothing. She had been practical her entire life, and every practical bone in her body told her this was reckless. She packed her trunk anyway, because the other option was to sit in a strange boarding house watching dust move in the light until her money ran out, and that was not, and had never been, the kind of woman she intended to be. She was afraid. She was more afraid than she had been on the train platform, more afraid than she'd been when she mailed the first letter to Warren Holt, more afraid, even, than she'd been the morning she carried her trunk down those boarding house steps in Millhaven while her landlady didn't bother to watch. But afraid was just a feeling. She'd had feelings before and survived them. 7 in the morning, she'd be ready. Outside, the wind picked up again and rattled the window glass, and somewhere out across the flat Kansas distance, on a ranch she hadn't seen yet, 2 little girls were going about their evening without any idea that the woman who would change all of their lives was sitting in a room in town, making up her mind. The buckboard left Caldwell at 7 minutes past 7, which bothered Maren slightly because she had been standing in front of the boarding house at 6:55 with her trunk and her traveling bag and her coat buttoned to the throat against the cold. Gideon pulled up without apology and without explanation, jumped down, loaded her trunk into the back with the feed sacks, and offered her a hand up onto the seat. She took it. His hand was rough and warm, and he let go the moment she was settled. They rode the first mile in silence. The town fell away quickly out here. A few buildings, a water tower, a scatter of fenced lots, and then nothing but grass and sky going in every direction until it hurt to look at. The road, such as it was, had been worn into the earth by wagon wheels, and was more suggestion than fact in certain stretches. Gideon guided the horses with the ease of someone who had done this particular drive so many times, his hands did it without asking his brain. "How old are your daughters?" Maren asked. She already knew. He'd told her in a letter, told Warren Holt in a letter, she corrected herself. But she wanted to hear him say it, wanted to hear how he said it. 6, he said. Lily and Clara. They're twins, but they don't look like it much. Lily's quieter. Clara talks enough for both of them. He paused. Clara also breaks things. I'm not sure if that's related. Maren almost smiled. Have they been told about me? I told them I was bringing someone out to visit. That's all? That's all I knew to tell them. He glanced at her sideways. I didn't want to make promises I couldn't keep. She understood that. She understood it in her bones. The ranch appeared after 40 minutes of driving, first as a low dark line against the grass, then slowly becoming a house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, a split-rail fence that needed work in 3 places she could see from the road. It was not a prosperous-looking place. It was not a desperate-looking one either. It was something in between. A place that had been built with intention and was currently being held together with stubbornness. 2 small figures were standing at the fence gate when the buckboard rolled in. One of them waved both arms. The other stood with her arms at her sides and watched the wagon approach with an expression of careful assessment that belonged, Maren thought, on someone much older. That was Lily. Maren could tell without being told. Clara, the one waving, had her father's dark coloring and an open face that showed everything she was thinking. She grabbed the fence rail and leaned out as Gideon pulled the horses to a stop. Is that her? Is that the lady? That's the lady, Gideon said, climbing down. Don't hang on the fence, Clara. I've told you. Clara dropped off the fence immediately and transferred her full attention to Maren, who was climbing down from the buckboard on her own because Gideon had gone to the horses' heads, and she was not the kind of woman who waited to be helped when she could manage. Her boot hit the ground, and she turned around and found Clara standing approximately 2 feet away, staring up at her with frank curiosity. You're not very pretty, Clara said. Clara. Gideon's voice was a warning. I'm not being mean, Clara said, genuinely confused by the correction. Mama was pretty. You look different. Maren crouched down so she was at eye level with the girl. Up close, Clara had a small scar on her chin, probably from a fall, and her braids had been done that morning but were already coming loose on the left side. "Your father did those braids," Marin said. It was not a question. Clara touched her hair, surprised. "Yes. He doesn't do them as good as Mama did." "No," Marin agreed, "but he does them every morning, doesn't he?" Clara looked at her. Something shifted in the child's expression. Not suspicion exactly, but the recalibration of someone who had expected something and gotten something else. "Yes," she said, quieter. Marin stood back up. Lily was still at the fence, still watching. Marin walked toward her. She didn't crouch this time. She stopped a few feet away and looked at the girl directly, the way she'd wanted to be looked at her whole life, straight on, without flinching. "I'm Marin," she said. "I know," Lily said. "Papa told us." "What did he tell you?" Lily considered this with the seriousness of a small judge. "He said you came a long way and things didn't work out the way you planned, and that you needed somewhere to go for a while." She paused. "He didn't say you were going to stay." "He told me the same thing," Marin said, "that we'd see." Lily looked at her for another long moment. Then she unlatched the gate and held it open, which was, Marin understood, the only welcome she was going to get from that quarter, and it was enough. Inside of the ranch house was clean in the way that a man keeping a house clean manages. Surfaces wiped, floors swept, but with an underlying sense of things slightly askew. The curtains on the kitchen window were faded and hung crooked because one of the hooks had come loose. The table had been scrubbed so many times the wood had gone pale in the middle. There were 2 small beds visible through a doorway, quilts pulled up but not quite straight. On the mantel, a photograph in a tin frame, a woman, dark-haired, laughing at something outside the frame. Dora Mercer. Marin looked at it once and looked away. Gideon showed her the room at the back of the house. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that faced the barn, and a hook on the back of the door. That was it. He stood in the doorway and said, "It's not much." "It's more than I had yesterday," Marin said. He nodded. "Breakfast is at 5:30. The girls need to be up by 5. I don't expect you to—" 5 o'clock, she said. "I'll be up." He looked at her like he wasn't sure whether to believe that, which she found irritating, and said nothing more. The first morning she was up at 4:45, out of habit, and sat in the cold kitchen until she found the coffee in the pot and made herself useful. When Gideon appeared at 5, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the coffee on the stove, and the table she had wiped down, and the girls' bowls already set out, and he said nothing, just went to the stove and poured himself a cup, and that was the first unspoken thing that passed between them. The work was relentless. Marin had known it would be, and had told herself she was ready, and discovered on the second day that knowing a thing and living a thing were separated by a distance that could not be crossed by any amount of thinking. She had ironed other people's clothes for 6 years. She had kept a single rented room clean. She had cooked on a small stove for 1 person. None of it had prepared her for the scale of a working ranch. The meals for 4, the laundry for 4, the floors that were dirty again by noon from men's boots and children's feet, the chickens that needed feeding, and the eggs that needed collecting, and the butter that needed churning, and the fence section Gideon mentioned needed mending before winter, which meant she was somehow expected to hold boards while he swung the hammer. She dropped a full pot of water crossing the kitchen on the 3rd morning. It went everywhere. She stood in the middle of the wet floor with her skirt soaked from the knee down and both hands empty, and she felt the particular despair of a person who has made a decision they are not certain was wise. Clara appeared in the doorway, looked at the floor, looked at Marin, and disappeared. Marin braced for something, laughter, maybe, or the sound of the girl going to tell her father. Clara came back with a rag mop that was almost as tall as she was. She held it out. "It happens all the time," she said. "Papa drops things too. He dropped a whole bag of flour once, and he said a word that Lily and I aren't supposed to say." Marin took the mop. "What word?" Clara looked at her with solemn eyes. "I can't tell you, but it was a really bad one." Marin mopped the floor. Clara sat at the kitchen table and watched, swinging her legs. "Are you going to stay?" Clara asked. "I don't know yet," Marin said. "Do you want to stay?" Marin stopped mopping for a moment. She looked at the wet floor and the small girl at the table and the window over the sink that showed nothing but flat gray sky. "I don't know that either," she said, which was honest. Clara seemed to find this acceptable. "Lily wants you to stay," she said, as though reporting the weather. Lily hasn't said 10 words to me. Lily doesn't say words, she decides things. Clara slid off the bench and picked up her coat from the hook. She decided about you on the first day. I'm not supposed to tell you that either, but I'm bad at keeping secrets. She went out the back door into the yard, leaving Marin alone with the mop and the wet floor, and a feeling in her chest she couldn't quite name. Lily proved harder. Lily was the kind of child who processed the world from a distance, who watched and catalogued and waited before she extended anything of herself. And Marin recognized this because she had been this child once, before life had beaten the habit out of her. She didn't push. She didn't try to win the girl over with treats or special attention, which she'd seen women do with motherless children and which usually made things worse. She just went about the work and let Lily watch. The break came in the second week, and it came sideways. Lily appeared in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening while Marin was mending one of Gideon's shirts, holding a length of ribbon and looking at the floor. She didn't say anything for a full minute. "My braid," she finally said. "Papa can't do the French one." Marin set the shirt down. "Sit," she said, and moved her chair so Lily could sit in front of her. She felt the girl tense as she touched her hair, felt her deliberating, felt the exact moment she decided to trust it. Marin worked slowly, with more care than the task required, and she did the French braid properly, tight enough to last the day, not so tight it pulled. When she was done, she tied the ribbon and said, "There." Lily reached up and touched the back of her head. She turned around and looked at Marin with an expression that was working very hard not to show what it was. "Thank you," she said. "Any time," Marin said. Lily stood there a moment longer. Then she went to the doorway and stopped. "Clara says you don't know if you want to stay." "Clara," Marin said carefully, "talks a great deal." "Do you?" Lily asked. "Want to stay?" Marin looked at this 6-year-old girl who carried her losses without complaint and watched the world from behind careful eyes, and she felt something move in her chest that she wasn't ready for. "I'm starting to," she said. Lily nodded once, as though this was the correct answer, and went to find her sister. Gideon watched all of this from a careful distance. I was not a man who interfered where he didn't need to, and he had enough to manage without manufacturing problems. The east pasture fence that kept pulling free from the frost heave, the cattle prices that were dropping again, the bill at the feed store that he was 3 weeks behind on. He watched Marin move through the work of the ranch with the manner of someone who had decided to do a thing and was going to do it without making a production of it, and something in this was so familiar to him that it ached. Dora had been different. Dora had been warmth and laughter, and a brightness that had filled this house so completely that when she died the silence had been physical, a weight in every room. He had loved her with the particular intensity of a man who had not expected to be loved and was therefore astonished by it. Her absence was still the central fact of his life, and he was honest enough with himself to know that some part of him had brought Marin here not because he was ready to replace what he'd lost, but because his daughters needed something he didn't know how to give them, and he was out of other options. That awareness sat uncomfortably alongside the other thing he was noticing, which was that Marin Holloway was not what he had anticipated. He had expected someone efficient and probably somewhat grim. What he had not expected was her steadiness, which was different from grimness. He had not expected her to drop that pot of water and then mop it up without making anyone feel her frustration. He had not expected the way she did Lily's braid with that particular care. He had not expected her, one evening at the end of the first week, to sit across the table from him after the girls were in bed and say, without preamble, "You're behind on the feed bill." He had looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I found the invoice in the drawer when I was looking for the candle stubs." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not prying into your business. I found it by accident, and I thought it was better to say so than to pretend I didn't see it." He had been irritated for a moment. A man's private financial failures were not casual dinner conversation. And then the irritation had faded because she was right, and she was looking at him without pity or judgment, just with that level, direct gaze she had. "It's been a hard couple of years," he said. "I know," she said. "I could take in some mending from town. I did it in Ohio. It's not a solution, but it's something." "That's not why I brought you here." "I know why you brought me here," she said. "I'm saying I could also do this." He had sat with that. Then he had said, "Let me think about it," which was what he said when he didn't want to say yes yet, but couldn't find a reason to say no. She had nodded and gone to bed, and he had sat at the kitchen table for another hour in the dark, turning something over in his mind that didn't quite have a shape yet. The town took an opinion. Of course it did. Small frontier towns always took opinions about things that weren't their business. And a woman living out at the Mercer Ranch without any official arrangement was the kind of situation Caldwell's social conscience could not leave alone. Marin went in with Gideon on supply day in her third week and felt the looks at the general store, heard the slight adjustment in the way the proprietor's wife spoke to her, polite but with a question underneath it. It was a woman named Helen Graft who said it directly. She stopped Marin outside the dry goods store while Gideon was at the feed barn and said with the expression of someone doing an unpleasant duty, "People are wondering about the arrangement out at the Mercer place." Marin looked at her. "People can wonder," she said. Helen's expression tightened. "You understand how it looks." "I understand how some people choose to look at it," Marin said. "Gideon Mercer is a decent man raising 2 daughters alone. I help with the household and the children. If that troubles people, that's a problem with their imaginations, not with his conduct or mine." Helen opened her mouth and closed it. "Good morning," Marin said, and walked away, her heart hammering, her face neutral. She did not tell Gideon about the conversation. He found out anyway. This was Caldwell, Kansas, and the only thing that traveled faster than weather was talk. And he brought it up that evening at supper with the girls at the table, which was the wrong moment, which meant he'd been sitting on it, and it had finally pushed its way out. "Helen Graft," he said. Marin put her fork down. The girls looked between the 2 adults with the alert interest of children who understand that something is happening even when they can't identify what. "It's handled," Marin said. "You should have told me." "Why? So you could handle it differently?" She kept her voice level. "I handled it. It's done." Something moved across his face. Not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it. The frustration of a man who was used to being the one who dealt with problems, who hadn't yet learned where this woman's edges were. "I don't want you fighting my battles," he said. "I wasn't fighting your battle," she said. "I was fighting mine." The girls were very still. Clara was gripping her spoon. Gideon looked at Marin for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Clara released the spoon. Lily went back to eating. The meal continued, and this was the second unspoken thing that passed between them. A boundary tested and acknowledged, a respect built from something that could have been a fight and wasn't. That night, Marin lay in her narrow back room and listened to the ranch settle around her. The creak of the house, the wind against the walls, somewhere distant, a coyote. She thought about Warren Holt. She thought about him in the specific way she'd been trying not to. Not the betrayal, which she was working on setting down, but the letters. What those letters had cost her. What she had let herself believe. She was not going to make that mistake again. Whatever this was, this careful provisional arrangement with Gideon Mercer and his daughters on this cold-backed Kansas ranch, she was not going to invest her hope in it the way she'd invested it in those letters. She was going to be useful, and she was going to be honest, and she was going to keep her feelings where she could see them and manage them, and she was not going to let herself need something she didn't know yet she could have. This was, she told herself, the sensible approach. She was also aware, lying in that narrow bed with the wind at the walls, that Lily had fallen asleep the previous evening with her head leaning against Marin's arm on the settee while Marin read aloud from the one book of children's stories the house possessed, and that Marin had not moved for 40 minutes rather than disturb her, and that this was not an entirely sensible thing to have done. The hard weather arrived in November without much warning. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single night, and the next morning the world outside the ranch house windows was a flat gray-white that made the distance disappear. Gideon was out before dawn, and when Marin got up at 4:45, the kitchen was cold and the fire had gone out. She rebuilt it with the competence of someone who had learned this the hard way on her second day, and had the kitchen warm and the oatmeal going by the time the girls appeared. Clara came in wrapped in her quilt. "Papa's going to freeze," she said with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who was used to worrying. "Your father has been managing winters on this ranch longer than you've been alive," Marin said. "That doesn't mean he can't freeze." Marin put a bowl in front of her. "Eat," she said. The cold snap lasted 4 days. The cattle needed moving, the water trough kept icing over, and Gideon came in each evening looking like something that had been left out in the weather and was considering whether to keep going. On the third evening, he sat down at the table and his hands were shaking enough that he couldn't get the buttons on his coat. And Marin came and did them from the bottom up without being asked. And he looked down at her hands working the buttons and said nothing, and she said nothing, and this was the third unspoken thing. He came down with a fever on the fourth day. Marin knew it from breakfast, the slight slowing of his movements, the way he looked at his coffee like it had personally disappointed him, the brightness around his eyes that wasn't alertness. "You're sick," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're going to be in bed by noon if you go out in that cold." "The cattle, tell me what needs doing," she said. "I'll do what I can and the rest will have to wait." He looked at her. "You don't know how to move cattle." "Then tell me," she said. He tried to explain and she listened and she went out in the cold and she did a portion of it badly and a portion of it adequately and she could not do the rest. And 2 of the cattle ended up in the wrong pasture for 2 days and had to be moved back later. And she came in that evening with cold burned cheeks and chapped hands and a temper she was managing by a narrow margin. And Gideon was in the chair by the fire because she'd made him stay. And he looked up when she came in. "Well," he said. "A portion of your cattle are in the wrong pasture," she said. "They're fine. You can fix it when you're not running a fever." He closed his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet. I may have also broken the latch on the south gate." He opened his eyes. Something shifted in them. A reluctant, exhausted, genuine amusement. "The latch on the south gate has been broken since August," he said. "I just haven't fixed it." She looked at him. "Gideon Mercer." "I'm aware," he said. She went to the kitchen to start supper, and she was aware that she was smiling, which she had not expected. The fever broke on the second day, and Gideon was up by the third morning, still pale and moving slightly carefully, but absolutely refusing to acknowledge any of it, which she had already identified as a defining characteristic of the man. He found her mending by the fire that evening, the girls already in bed, and he sat down across from her and said, without leading up to it, "Why did you really come west?" She looked up. "I told you why. You told me about the letters in Holt. But women in your situation, sensible women, not reckless ones, they don't usually stake everything on a letter-writing campaign." She set the mending in her lap. "Are you calling me reckless or sensible?" "I'm genuinely not sure yet," he said. She looked at the fire. "I was 40 years old in a rented room," she said, "except I was 31. I had a job that I was good at and a life that had edges I could see from the middle of it. I could see every direction it was going to go from there, and none of the directions were—" She stopped. "I'm not explaining it well." "You're explaining it fine," he said. She looked at him. "I just didn't want to reach the end of it and find out I'd only ever been careful." She paused. "That probably sounds foolish." "No," he said, "it doesn't." They sat with the fire between them and the dark Kansas night outside the windows, and Marin picked up the mending again. And Gideon leaned back in the chair and watched the fire. And neither of them said anything more that evening, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was something else. A silence that had room in it. A silence that 2 people could share without either of them drowning in it. 3 days later, Gideon came in from the barn in the late afternoon and found Marin in the kitchen with both girls, Clara standing on a stool, trying to cut biscuit shapes out of dough, while Lily watched with the expression of someone waiting patiently for disaster. The kitchen smelled of flour and the fire and something with cinnamon in it, and Gideon stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at the scene, and something crossed his face so quickly that Marin almost missed it. Almost. She saw it. And she looked away before he could notice that she had. "Wash up," she said to no one in particular, to everyone. "Supper in 20 minutes. Clara held up a biscuit shape that was technically more of a polygon. "Look, Papa." "That's a fine—" He paused. "Shape," he said. "It's a horse," Clara said. "I can see that now," he said. "Absolutely a horse." Lily caught Marin's eye across the kitchen, and for the first time Lily Mercer smiled at her. It was small and quick and gone almost before it arrived, but Marin saw it, and she held it carefully in some interior place where she was keeping things she wasn't yet ready to examine. Clara's biscuit horse burned slightly on one side at supper, and was declared by its creator to be the best thing she had ever eaten. The night settled over the ranch, and the wind came as it always did, and the fire burned low, and the 4 people inside this small, uneven house went to their beds, each carrying their private freight of loss and hope and uncertainty, and the Kansas dark closed around them, indifferent to all of it, and the morning would come at 4:45 as it always did, and Maren Holloway would be up to meet it. She was still afraid. She was afraid most of the time now, though it was a different shape of fear than she'd had before. Before she had been afraid of staying still. Now she was afraid of wanting something specific. This kitchen, this fire, these two girls, this difficult quiet man with his shaking hands and his broken Southgate latch, afraid of wanting it the way she'd wanted the letters to be true. But the fear had changed. It was quieter now. It fit inside her life instead of filling it. That was something. She was not sure yet what it was, but it was something, and Maren Holloway had built more than one thing out of less. December arrived the way it always did on the Kansas plains, without negotiation. The cold settled into the ranch house through every gap in the boards, and Maren found herself stuffing rags around the window frames in her back room and telling herself this was practical, not desperate, which was the kind of distinction she made with herself often. She had been at the Mercer Ranch for 6 weeks. The original agreement, a week, just to see, had passed without either of them naming it, and then another week had passed the same way. And now there was a wordless understanding that she was here through winter at least, which was both more and less than a promise. The girls had changed. Clara had stopped being cautious around her entirely, which meant Clara was now a force of nature that arrived in Maren's mornings with questions and commentary and the occasional small disaster that was never entirely Clara's fault, according to Clara. Lily was different. Lily's change was slower and more significant. She had started doing a thing that broke Maren's composure more than she liked to admit, which was finding reasons to be in whatever room Maren was in. Not talking, not asking for anything. Just being present, the way cats settle near people they've decided to trust. Maren was braiding Lily's hair every morning now. It had become a fixed point of the day, something both of them moved toward without discussing it. And sometimes while she worked the braid, Lily would say something that revealed the interior life of a 6-year-old who thought about things too seriously and too deeply, and Maren would answer as honestly as she knew how, which was the only way she knew how to speak to children. On one such morning in early December, while Maren's fingers worked through Lily's dark hair, Lily said, "Do you miss where you came from?" Maren thought about Millhaven, the boarding house, the ironing table, the landlady who hadn't watched her leave. "No," she said. "Not at all? Not in the way you're thinking." She tied the end of the braid. "I miss some ideas I had, but the place itself, no." Lily was quiet for a moment. "I miss Mama," she said, "but I can't remember her voice anymore. I remember her face, and I remember her hands, but the voice is gone." Maren set down the ribbon. She came around to face Lily and crouched in front of her. Lily's expression was the contained one. Not crying, not going to cry, simply stating a fact that was also a wound. "That happens," Maren said. "It doesn't mean you're forgetting her." "Clara says it does." "Clara is 6 years old," Maren said, "and she's wrong about this." Lily looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because you remembered to miss her voice. You can't miss something you've forgotten." She waited while Lily processed this. "The voice will come back sometimes, in dreams, or when something reminds you. It doesn't stay gone." Lily looked at her for a long moment with those old, careful eyes. Then she leaned forward and put her arms around Maren's neck, brief and tight and over before Maren could respond to it properly. And then she slid off the chair and went to put on her boots, and Maren stayed crouched by the chair for a moment, with her hands open in her lap, steadying herself before she stood up. Gideon had not been in the kitchen during this. She was glad of that. She was not ready to have him see what that small embrace had done to her. The trouble with feelings you're trying to manage is that they grow in the dark where you're not looking. Maren knew she was in danger of something. She had known it since the evening she'd caught the look on Gideon's face in the kitchen doorway. That flash of something unguarded, something that had crossed his features when he saw his daughters and this woman he'd brought home from a train platform, all of them together in the ordinary warmth of a kitchen. She'd looked away from it. She'd been looking away from it ever since. The problem was that Gideon was not easy to look away from in the way she needed to. He was not a man who performed himself. He said what he meant and meant what he said and went quiet when he had nothing worth saying, which was a quality she had not encountered often enough in people to take for granted. She had watched him be patient with Lily in the specific way that Lily required, not forcing, not rushing, just waiting. and she had watched him be patient with the ranch when it failed him, which it did regularly and in new and creative ways. And she had watched him be patient with himself in the evenings, when he was tired and used up, and clearly not feeling patient at all. She had not watched him be patient with her because he hadn't needed to be. They moved around each other with a surprising lack of friction for two people who had started as strangers in a provisional arrangement. They disagreed sometimes. About the South pasture, about whether Clara's increasing boldness needed correction or celebration, about the right way to salt beef for winter. And these disagreements were brief and direct and left no residue. This too was new to her. She'd lived her life in spaces where conflict gathered and pooled and was never quite resolved, just moved around. And the clean economy of arguing with Gideon Mercer and then being finished with it was something she had not known to want until she had it. She was in trouble. She knew she was in trouble. She managed this the way she managed most things, by getting up at 4:45 and working until dark, and keeping the feeling in a box where she could see it but not let it run. Gideon, for his part, was having a harder time than he showed. He had not planned for this. He had planned for a capable woman who could help with the girls and the household and earn her keep, honestly. Someone adequate for the task, because adequate was what he thought he was looking for. Not another love, not another Dora, not another crack in himself that someone could slip through and rearrange him. He'd had that once, and losing it had nearly unmade him, and his daughters needed him whole and present and functional, not pulled apart by something he couldn't control. What he had not planned for was Maren Holloway specifically. He couldn't have planned for her because she wasn't the kind of person you anticipated. She had no performance to her. She didn't try to make him like her, didn't soften her edges to make the arrangement easier, didn't pretend the work wasn't hard, or that she always knew what she was doing. The week she'd had to move those cattle alone while he sweated through a fever had resulted in 2 cows in the wrong pasture and 1 broken gate latch that was already broken, and she had reported all of this with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone who understood that pretending otherwise would only make things worse later. He respected her. This had happened before he noticed it happening, which was the usual way respect worked. The other thing was harder to name, and he had not tried to name it yet. He kept it at a distance by being busy, which on a cattle ranch in December was not difficult, and by reminding himself that Maren was a woman who had been badly used by someone who'd made her promises, and the last thing she needed from him was another man treating her like a solution to his problems. This was a reasonable thing to tell himself. He told it to himself fairly regularly. It stopped working on the 15th of December. He had come in from the barn after dark, which was later than usual because one of the horses had thrown a shoe and he'd had to sort it in the cold, and he was tired in the deep way that cold work in the dark produces, the kind of tired that gets into the marrow. The house was warm. The girls were in bed. He could hear them. Clara's small snore, Lily's quiet breathing, familiar sounds that were the architecture of his life. Maren was at the kitchen table. She had a letter in front of her. She was not reading it. She was sitting with it flat on the table under her hands, and she was looking at the fire, and she didn't hear him come in. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He could see her profile, the line of her jaw, the set of her mouth, something in her posture that was not sadness exactly, but was its neighbor. He didn't know what was in the letter. He knew she had received mail in Caldwell on Supply Day and had folded it into her coat pocket without comment, and he had not asked. He should go to the stove and get the last of the coffee and let her have her privacy. He went to the stove. He poured the coffee. He turned around and her eyes were open, and she had seen him, and her face had moved back to neutral, which told him it had been somewhere else. "Bad news?" he asked. She looked at the letter. "My mother died," she said, "in September. This is from her husband's daughter. We aren't close." He set his coffee down. He sat at the table across from her, not at the other end, but across, the width of the table between them. "I'm sorry," he said. "We weren't close either," she said. "My mother and I." She folded the letter. "She remarried when I was 14 and her husband didn't want another man's child underfoot. I told you some of this." "You did?" "I used to think I'd make a different kind of life than hers. Something, I don't know, more." She turned the folded letter over in her hands. I think she was lonely and didn't know any other way to handle it. "Do you need to go back?" She looked at him. "There's nothing to go back for." He held her gaze. He should say something adequate, something useful or comforting or at least appropriate. What came out instead was, "You're not going to end up like her." Marin was very still. "I don't say that to," he started. "I know why you said it," she said. Her voice was careful and level, and something underneath it was not. "Thank you." They sat there. The fire settled and the dark outside was total, the Kansas winter pressing against the walls of the house. Gideon did not move. Marin did not move. And he became aware, in the specific and unwelcome way that awareness arrives when you've been working hard to avoid it, that he did not want her to be unhappy. Not in the abstract charitable way a decent person hopes for another decent person. In a specific way. In a way that had a shape and a weight and an address. He picked up his coffee and stood up. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too," she said. He went to his room and lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and had a direct conversation with himself about what he was and was not going to do, which lasted approximately 40 minutes and was not conclusive. The thing that cracked them open, not dramatically, the way stories like to arrange things, but in the ordinary, irreversible way real things crack, happened 3 days before Christmas. He had gone to town alone to pick up supplies and had come back in the late afternoon to find the ranch house silent in a way that was wrong. He knew immediately something had happened, not catastrophic, because the house was still standing and the smoke was coming from the chimney, but wrong. He unhitched the horses fast and went inside. The kitchen table had a towel over something. Clara was sitting on the settle with her knees pulled up, which was her posture when she was frightened. Lily was at the kitchen window. Marin was not in the room. "Where is she?" he said. "Back room," Lily said, without turning from the window. He went to the back room and knocked. A pause, then, "I'm all right." He opened the door anyway. She was sitting on the narrow bed with her right hand wrapped in a cloth that had blood coming through it. She looked up at him with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to seem ordinary. "The axe slipped," she said, splitting the kindling. "It's not as bad as it looks." He crossed the room and crouched in front of her and took her wrapped hand in both of his without asking. She let him. He unwrapped the cloth carefully, and the cut across her palm was deep and had bled considerably, and she was right that it was not as bad as it could have been, but it was bad enough. "You should have sent one of the girls to the neighbors," he said. He was working to keep his voice even. "Mrs. Aldine would have come." "It would have frightened them," she said. "I didn't want them frightened." "You're frightened," he said. A pause. "A little," she admitted. He rewrapped the hand firmly and held it. He was aware of being very close to her. The narrow room, the narrow bed, his hands around hers, her face at eye level when he was crouching. Her breath had steadied, but it was still slightly short. "I need to clean this properly," he said. "I know," she said. He got the things he needed and came back and cleaned the wound and bandaged it correctly, and she sat still and let him without complaining, which told him it hurt a great deal, because Marin Holloway did not accept help without a good reason. When he was done, she looked at the bandage. "I split about half the kindling before it happened," she said. "That's not... I'm just saying I got half of it done." He looked at her. Something in him that had been held at careful distance for 6 weeks moved without his permission. "Marin," he said. She looked at him. Her dark eyes were steady and tired and still slightly too bright from pain. And she was sitting on a narrow bed in a cold back room in the middle of Kansas with her hand wrapped in his bandaging. And she was 31 years old and had come 600 miles and been left on a platform and had moved cattle alone in the cold and dried tears she probably thought he hadn't noticed. And she was telling him she'd gotten half the kindling done. "I don't know how to do this right," he said. The words came out rough and uncareful, and were not the words he'd have chosen if he'd been planning to say them. "I did it once and I knew how, or I thought I did, and then I lost it, and I'm not..." He stopped. She waited. "I'm not saying this as a proposition," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just need you to know that what you've done here, what you've meant to this house, to those girls, to..." He caught himself. "I don't want you to think that I haven't noticed." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he wondered if he'd miscalculated badly, said something she didn't want said, upset whatever balance they'd built. "I know you've noticed," she said quietly. "I've been trying not to notice that you've noticed." He absorbed that. "Why?" She looked at their hands, his still around her bandaged one, not gripping, just there. Because the last time I believed someone's letters, I ended up on a train platform in Kansas. She paused. Because you've got two daughters who've already lost their mother, and I won't be another person who walks into their lives and then leaves. I won't be that. Her voice was even, but her jaw was tight. So until we both know what this is, I can't afford to want it. Gideon sat with that. He sat with it for long enough that the fire settled in the other room, and a gust hit the side of the house and shook the window in its frame. That's fair, he said. I'm not saying no, she said. And something in the stumble of it told him it was costing her to say this plainly. I know, he said. I'm saying I need it to be real before I let myself have it. So do I, he said. And he meant it in the way he hadn't let himself mean anything in 2.5 years. He let go of her hand carefully. He stood up. He went to the door and turned back. Half the kindling, he said. She looked up at him. That's a lot of kindling, he said. Something shifted in her face. Not a full smile, but the shape of one, the bones of it. It is a lot of kindling, she said. He went back to the kitchen. He sat with his daughters, Clara climbing immediately into his lap, to tell him everything that had happened in the last 4 hours at high speed and in considerable detail, and Lily sitting beside him and leaning against his arm without comment. And he looked at the door to the back room and he felt something that had been braced against itself for a long time. Begin, very slowly, to let go. The week before Christmas, a thing happened that none of them had planned, and that mattered more than anything planned could have. Clara was sick. It came on suddenly the way children's illnesses do. Fine at supper, burning up by midnight, fretful and frightened in the dark. Gideon heard her first and was in the girls' room before Maren, but Maren was there inside a minute, appearing in the doorway in her coat pulled over her nightgown, her hair down, fully awake in the way of people who sleep lightly from habit. They worked around each other without discussion. Gideon managing Clara, who wanted her father and nobody else when she was sick, while Maren got cool water in the cloth and sat on the edge of Lily's bed, because Lily was sitting up straight in the dark, not saying anything, watching her sister with the particular quiet that meant she was very frightened. Maren put her arm around Lily's shoulders. Lily didn't lean in right away. She sat rigid for a moment and then slowly let herself be pulled sideways. She's going to be all right, Maren said. You don't know that, Lily said. No, Maren agreed, but her fever isn't that high and she's moving around and yelling, which are good signs. Mama had a fever, Lily said. Very flat, very quiet. Maren held her tighter. She didn't say anything for a moment because she understood that sometimes the truthful thing was not to argue with fear, but to sit next to it. Your papa is right there, she said finally. And so am I. We're not going anywhere. Lily said nothing, but she turned her face into Maren's shoulder, and Maren held her in the dark room while across from them Gideon talked his sick daughter through her discomfort in the low, steady voice that she'd heard him use on the horses. And Clara's fretful sounds began to calm, and the long winter night moved around them. Clara's fever broke by morning. She spent the day on the settee wrapped in her quilt, demanding stories and receiving more patient attention than her condition perhaps warranted, which she was not above enjoying. By the following day she was well enough to be tiresome, and then well enough to be herself, which in the Mercer household meant loud and in motion. Gideon found Maren at the kitchen window the morning Clara came back fully to herself, watching through the glass as the girl tore across the yard after one of the barn cats. His voice was quiet when he spoke. Were you scared? He said. Maren didn't turn from the window. Yes, she said. He stood beside her. They both watched Clara chase the cat, who was dramatically faster and knew it. Me too, he said. A pause. The wind. The cat escaping under the fence. Clara changing course and finding something else to pursue. The ordinary, magnificent chaos of a child who did not know she had frightened 2 adults out of 2 good nights of sleep. She called for you, Maren said. When she was sick, she wanted her papa. I know. That's right, Maren said. That's how it should be. She paused. She also asked me at about 3 a.m. to tell her a story. She didn't want to wake you up again. He looked at her profile. What did you tell her? I made something up, she said, about a girl who could talk to horses. It wasn't very good. Was Clara satisfied with it? She fell asleep in the middle of it, so I suppose so. Marin finally turned from the window. Her face was tired, but something in it was open in a way it wasn't always. At 3 in the morning, in a dark room, your daughter asked me for a story instead of waking you up. Do you understand what that means? He understood exactly what it meant. He also understood that Marin was telling him this not as sentiment, but as evidence. As a woman who had said, I need it to be real, presenting him with something real. He understood that she was not a person who did things like that without intention. I understand, he said. She nodded and went to start the day's work. And he stood at the window a moment longer, watching his daughter fail to catch a barn cat in the cold December yard, and he felt something click into place, not with drama, not with declaration, but with the quiet inevitability of a thing that has been moving toward its position for a long time and has finally arrived. Christmas came to the Mercer Ranch with modest ceremony. Myron made a pie from the dried apples she'd put up in November. Gideon produced a small package for each girl, a set of wooden animals for Clara, a book for Lily, both obtained in Caldwell, on a supply trip without comment or announcement. For Marin, he produced, from a coat pocket, a pair of good wool gloves, and he handed them to her without ceremony while the girls were occupied with their gifts. She looked at them, then at him. Your hands were cold the whole time you were moving that cattle, he said, by way of explanation, which was not the whole explanation. She put the gloves on. They fit properly. She looked at her hands in them and then back at him. Thank you, Gideon, she said, and there was something in the way she said his name, not different exactly, but inhabited differently, the name as a thing she was allowing herself to use rather than merely using, that told him she had moved some small interior distance. That evening, the girls fell asleep early, worn out by the day, and Gideon and Marin sat by the fire. He had a glass of the whiskey he kept for difficult occasions. She had tea. The fire was good, and the house was warm, and outside the snow that had threatened all week was finally coming down, soft and total, burying the imperfect world of the Mercer Ranch under something clean. Tell me something about Dora, Marin said. She said it carefully, watching him. He was quiet for a moment. He had not talked about Dora with another adult since she died. His conversations about Dora had been with the girls, answering their questions, keeping her present for them, telling the stories they asked for. This was different. She laughed at things I didn't expect, he said slowly. She'd be serious about something for a long time, and then something small and stupid would catch her, and He gestured, a brief open movement of his hand. She thought I was funny. I never thought I was funny. Marin looked at him. You're sometimes funny, she said. Not reliably. Something pulled at his mouth. She would have liked you, he said, and meant it, and felt the truth of it land without the grief he might have expected, with something more like gratitude, which surprised him. Marin looked at the fire. I think I would have liked her, she said. They sat a while longer. The snow came down. The fire burned. The sleeping sounds of 2 small girls came quietly through the walls of the house. We said we'd wait until we knew what this was, Marin said finally. He looked at her. I'm starting to know, she said. She did not look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on the fire, and her hands were around her cup, and she was braced in that particular way she had, not afraid of the thing itself, but of saying it, of letting it be spoken, and therefore real, and therefore losable. He set his glass down. He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and looked at the same fire. So am I, he said. Outside, the snow kept coming, patient and indifferent, covering the broken fence latch on the south gate and the east pasture, and the 2 improperly placed cows that were now correctly placed, covering everything that had been provisional and imperfect and held together with stubbornness, and making it look, for one night, like something that had always been exactly where it was supposed to be. January on the Kansas plains had a specific quality of cold that Marin had not encountered anywhere in Ohio. It was not merely cold. It was cold with intention, cold that found the gaps in your coat and the thin places in your boots, and the moments when you stood still too long and forgot to keep your blood moving. The ranch house held its warmth reasonably well by frontier standards, which meant that the back room where Marin slept required 2 quilts and a banked fire, and the understanding that mornings would be hard until the kitchen stove got going. She had stopped minding this somewhere in the 3rd week of January. She was not sure when exactly, only that one morning she got up at 4:45 into the cold dark and felt not dread, but something closer to purpose, which was a thing she had not felt about mornings in a very long time. The something that had been named on Christmas Eve, not named exactly, more like acknowledged, the way you acknowledge a thing you've both been looking at without pointing at it, had not been spoken of again directly. This was not avoidance. It was more like a seed that both of them understood needed particular conditions before it could be pushed, and neither of them was inclined to push it wrong. They had both, in their separate ways, learned what happened when you hurried towards something before it was ready. What had changed was smaller and larger simultaneously. The way he handed her the coffee cup in the mornings, not placed on the table but handed, direct, with a brief contact of fingers that was entirely accidental and entirely not. The way she had started saying his name slightly differently, as she'd noticed herself doing at Christmas, using it the way you use something that belongs to you. The way the girls had stopped treating the two of them as separate presences in the house, and had begun to treat them as a unit, in the unconscious way children do when they've reclassified the adults around them. Lily was the one who made this explicit, because Lily was always the one who made explicit what everyone else was managing to leave implicit. She came to Marin on a Tuesday morning in late January while Marin was working the butter churn, and she stood in the kitchen with her arms at her sides and said, without preamble, "Are you going to marry Papa?" Marin kept churning. "What makes you ask that?" "Clara and I were talking about it." "And what did you and Clara conclude?" Lily considered. "Clara thinks yes. She says you look at Papa the same way Mrs. Aldine looks at her husband when he does something stupid, but she loves him anyway." A pause. "I think that's what it looks like too." Marin stopped churning. She looked at this small, serious person who had her father's habit of saying true things plainly, and her dead mother's eyes and the particular gravity of a child who had lost too much too early and become careful about what she let herself want. "How would you feel about it?" Marin asked. "If we did?" Lily was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to mean she was actually thinking, not stalling. "I'd feel—" She stopped. Tried again. "When Mama died, Papa was here, but he wasn't here. You know how that is? He was in the house, but something in him went somewhere else, and we couldn't get to it." Marin knew exactly how that was. "And then you came," Lily said, "and he's here again, all of him." She looked at her hands. "I think that matters more than whether I want a new mother. I want my Papa back. I think you're the reason he came back." Marin sat down on the kitchen stool. She had not planned to sit down. Her legs made the decision without her. "Lily," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "I'm not trying to make you cry," Lily said, with the alarmed practicality of a child confronting an adult's emotions. "I know," Marin said. "You're not." She pressed her hands flat on her knees and steadied herself. "What Clara thinks, and what you think, it matters to me. Very much. I need you to know that." Lily nodded once, satisfied, and went to find her sister, and Marin sat in the kitchen with the half-churned butter, and the cold morning light, and the specific ache of being told something true by a 6-year-old that she hadn't known she needed to hear. She did not tell Gideon about this conversation for 3 days. When she did, they were fixing the fence on the south side of the property, a job that required 2 people, one to hold and one to hammer, and she told him between the 3rd and 4th post without looking at him. He stopped hammering. She held the post. "Keep going," she said. "The ground's going to freeze again by morning." He kept hammering, 3 more strikes before he said, "She said that." "She did." "That I wasn't. That I was gone." "Yes." 2 more strikes. The post was solid. He moved to the next one. She moved with him, gloved hands on the next post, and the cold came across the flat land and hit them both. "She's not wrong," he said. "I know she's not wrong." He looked at her over the post. "Marin." "I'm holding the post," she said. "Hit it." He hit it. She watched his face while he worked, the focused set of it, the effort, the slight wince when the cold got into the old injury in his right shoulder that he'd never mentioned but that she'd noticed on bad weather mornings. She had not mentioned that she'd noticed. There were things you noticed about a person that you held quietly, not to use but simply because they mattered, and you were the one who saw them. He set the hammer down. He looked at her across the fence line, the flat winter land behind him, the ranch house visible in the distance, smoke coming from the chimney. "I've been trying to work out how to say something," he said, "for about 6 weeks. "That's a long time," she said. "I'm not good at this," he said. I was good at it once, with Dora, but it came easier then because I was younger and stupider, and didn't know yet what it cost if it went wrong. She kept her hands on the post even though it didn't need holding anymore. It gave her something to do with herself. I'm not asking you to forget what Holt did, he said. I'm not asking you to pretend this started any way other than the way it started, which was unusual. Unusual, she said. I'm asking you to stay, he said. Not the way it is now, permanently, as my wife. He stopped. I realize I've done this badly. You've done it fine, she said. I haven't said anything about... I haven't told you. Gideon, she said. I know. He looked at her. I know, she said again, quieter. I've known for a while. I've just been waiting until I was sure you knew too. A pause. The wind. The fence line stretching out across the winter grass. Are you saying yes? He said. I'm saying yes, she said. He stood very still for a moment, the way a man stands when something he'd stopped trusting himself to hope for has just turned out to be real. Then he reached across the fence post and put his hand alongside her face, briefly, cold, rough fingers against her cold cheek, and she turned her face slightly into his palm before she could think about whether to. And that was that. They finished the fence. It took another 40 minutes, and the ground was hardening, and two of the posts were not entirely straight. And when they stepped back to look at their work, Gideon said, "The third one's crooked." And Maren said, "It'll hold." And he said, "It'll hold," in a tone that agreed with her, and they walked back to the house in the early dark, not holding hands because their hands were full of tools, but close enough that their arms touched with every other step. The girls were told at supper. Gideon did the telling, plainly and without ceremony, which was the only way he knew how to do things. Claire's face went from ordinary to incandescent in about half a second, and she came off the bench and attached herself to Maren with the wholehearted physical commitment of a child who had decided something and was acting on it completely. Lily sat at the table and looked at her plate, and then looked at Maren with an expression that was trying very hard not to be what it was. And Maren met her eyes and held them, and Lily nodded once, the smallest motion, and then looked back at her plate and picked up her fork and said, "Can we have the apple pie now?" "We don't have apple pie," Maren said. "We should have apple pie," Lily said, "for occasions." "Next time I'll plan ahead," Maren said. "Next time," Lily said, with the faintest suggestion of something that was almost a smile. "I'll help you make it." The spring thaw brought complications, as spring on a cattle ranch always did, and the weeks between the fence line proposal and any actual wedding were consumed by the unromantic reality of a working ranch coming out of winter. There were cattle to move and assess and treat. There were fences that had not held through the hard freezes. There was the feed bill that Maren had now seen enough of to understand in full, which was worse than she'd let on when she'd first found the invoice in the kitchen drawer. She started taking in mending again. She had raised it again in January, and Gideon had said, with the expression of a man who had thought it over properly this time, "All right." So word went to Caldwell that Maren Holloway, the name would change soon enough, but it was still the name the town knew, was taking work, and the work came in modest but steady, and she did it in the evenings after the girls were in bed, and every dollar that came in from it she kept separate and told Gideon about directly. He didn't like it. Not the mending itself, the economics were plain and he understood them, but the fact of her needing to do it, the evidence in his own kitchen of the gap between what the ranch was and what it should be. This was a pride that she understood because she'd had it herself, the particular sting of needing help from the very person you most wanted to provide for. "It's temporary," she said one evening, not looking up from the shirt she was mending. "I know it's temporary," he said. "I'm not doing it to make a point." "I know that too." "Then what's the face for?" He looked at her. "What face?" "The one that's been sitting across from me for 20 minutes, looking like the shirt did something personal to you." A pause. Something reluctant crossed his expression. "I wanted to give you something better than this," he said, "when I asked you. I wanted the ranch to be more than it is." She set the shirt down. "Gideon, I came here with $11.40 and nowhere to go. I am not measuring what you've given me against some other version of what it might have been." "I measure it," he said. "Stop," she said. "We're building it. That's different from having it handed to you, and it's better, actually, because you know what every piece of it cost." He looked at her for a long moment. "When did you get so certain about everything?" he said, and there was something in it that was not quite a complaint. "I'm not certain about everything," she said. "I'm just certain about this." She picked the shirt back up. "Hand me the other spool of thread, the darker one." He found it and handed it to her and went back to his own work. And the evening settled around them, ordinary and sufficient, which was everything. It was in April that Warren Holt came back into the story. Not dramatically, life did not arrange itself dramatically, in Marin's experience. And the return of Warren Holt was less a confrontation than an awkward collision. She was in Caldwell on supply day when she saw him. He was coming out of the bank as she was going past, and they nearly walked into each other, and there was a half second where both of them registered what was happening before either of them could manage a reaction. He looked older than she remembered, though it had only been 6 months. Or maybe she was seeing him differently now that she wasn't looking at him through 16 months of letters and the accumulated weight of hope. "Miss Holloway," he said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Mr. Holt," she said. A silence. He adjusted the brim of his hat. "I heard you've been out at the Mercer place," he said. "I'm going to marry Gideon Mercer," she said. "This spring." Something moved across his face. It might have been guilt. It might have been something less flattering. "I wanted to," he started. "You don't need to," she said. "I'd rather you didn't, actually." He looked at her. "Are you angry?" She considered this question with more genuine attention than he probably expected. Was she angry? She reached for the feeling and found something smaller than anger, something that had been anger once and had been sitting out long enough to reduce down. "No," she said. "Not anymore." She paused. "You did me a kindness, actually. I know that's not how you meant it." He opened his mouth and she could see he was going to say something that would be either defensive or apologetic, and she didn't have time for either. "I need to get to the dry goods store before they close the back stockroom," she said. "Congratulations on whatever arrangement you made with the woman in the yellow dress, Mr. Holt." She walked past him and did not look back. She told Gideon that evening. She told him directly because she had learned that direct was always better, and because she did not want there to be a version of events that he heard second or third hand from Caldwell's efficient rumor circuit. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened. "Are you all right?" he asked when she was done. "Yes," she said. "I was worried I would be angry, and I'm not. That's a good thing, I think." "You said he did you a kindness." "He did." She looked at the fire. "If he'd walked toward me on that platform instead of past me, I'd be on his ranch right now trying to be the woman those letters described. And I'm not sure I could have been." She paused. "I think I'm better at being this." "Being what?" he said. She gestured around them. The kitchen, the fire, the sounds of the girls in the other room, him at the table with the ranch accounts spread out in front of him. "This," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then looked back at his accounts. But something in his face had settled in a way she'd come to recognize. That was enough said. They both knew it. The dress arrived in May, 3 weeks before the wedding, and it was not something Marin had arranged. She came in from the barn one afternoon to find the girls at the kitchen table with a conspiratorial energy she recognized and distrusted, and Gideon standing to one side with the particular expression of a man who has been talked into something by his daughters and has now committed to it. Clara was vibrating. There was no other word for it. She had her hands clasped in front of her, and she was vibrating. "We made you something," she announced. "Lily made most of it because I'm not good at sewing, but I held things and chose colors." On the table was a package wrapped in brown paper. Marin looked at it and looked at them. "What is this?" "Open it," Clara said. The vibrating intensified. She opened it. The dress was pale blue, not the washed-out blue of things that have been laundered too many times, but a real blue, a decided blue, the kind of blue that meant someone had spent money they'd saved carefully. It had been sewn by someone who knew what they were doing, which was not Lily, who was 7 and learning, but she had clearly contributed. There were small, imperfect stitches at the hem that were entirely Lily's, and they were part of the dress without apology, which made the whole thing more true somehow. Marin held it up. She looked at Gideon. "I had help from Mrs. Aldean for the cutting and the bodice," he said. "The girls did the rest." "I chose the blue," Clara said. "Papa wanted green, but green was wrong. I told him." "Green was wrong," Lily confirmed, from the authority of someone who had sewn the hem. Marin set the dress down on the table and pressed both hands flat on it for a moment. She was doing the thing she'd told Lily she wasn't doing, which was working to keep her face from going somewhere she wasn't ready to display. It didn't entirely work. "It fits you," Clara announced, somehow certain of this without the dress having been tried on. "I told Papa your size. I measured your other dress with a string." Marin looked at this child who had measured her dress with a string. "When?" "Weeks ago," Clara said. "I'm sneaky when I need to be." Lily caught Marin's eye with an expression that said clearly, "I tried to tell her not to admit that." Marin picked up the dress. She looked at Gideon over it. He was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, and that expression he wore when he'd done something he thought was right and was waiting to find out if it was. "It's the most beautiful thing I own," she said. "It's the only dress you have that isn't brown or dark gray," Clara said, with the directness of a child who had clearly thought about this. "Clara," Lily said. "I'm not being mean," Clara said. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference, Lily. I've explained this." Marin laughed. It was not a polite or restrained laugh. It came out of somewhere real and surprised her slightly with its own existence. Gideon smiled, the full one, not the near smile he used most of the time, and Clara beamed as though she had caused the laughter on purpose, which she possibly had. The wedding was the 23rd of May. It was a Friday, which was not a traditional wedding day, but the preacher was available Friday and not Saturday, and there was rain forecast for Sunday, so Friday it was. Marin had not spent much energy on the arrangements because there was a ranch to run, and she was more interested in the marriage than in the wedding, which was a distinction she'd made to Mrs. Aldine when that well-meaning woman had begun discussing table arrangements, and which Mrs. Aldine had found both sensible and slightly disappointing. The ceremony was at the small church in Caldwell, because Gideon had asked the girls where they wanted it, and both of them had said the church without deliberating, so the church it was. Marin wore the blue dress. She had let Lily braid her hair that morning, which meant the roles had reversed from all those kitchen mornings, and Lily had worked with a seriousness and care that produced the best braid Marin had ever worn, which she told her, and Lily accepted this assessment with dignity. The people who came were mostly people Marin had met over the winter. Mrs. Aldine and her husband, the proprietor from the general store, and his wife, who had looked at Marin with that pointed politeness in her early weeks, a ranching family named Hurst, who had been neighbors to Gideon for years and who had brought a pie. A handful of others. Not many, which was right. This was not a spectacle. It was a fact being made official. Warren Holt was there. Marin saw him when she came through the church door, and her step faltered for half a second, which no one noticed because Clara chose that moment to announce loudly that Marin looked like a real bride now, which redirected everyone's attention. Holt was at the back, on the outside edge of a pew, and when Marin looked at him, his expression was complicated in a way she didn't have time to analyze. She didn't need to analyze it. She had meant what she'd said on the street outside the bank in April. He had done her a kindness. She could afford to let him witness what his kindness had led to. She walked up the aisle, not on anyone's arm because she was 31 years old and had come 600 miles on her own and did not need to be delivered. And Gideon was standing at the front with the preacher, and he was watching her come toward him with an expression that was very still and very present, the way he was when something mattered to him most. The girls were in the front pew. Clara had her hands clasped in her lap and was trying very hard to remain seated, which was costing her visible effort. Lily was sitting straight with her hands folded, and she looked at Marin coming up the aisle, and her face, Lily's usually contained and careful face, was entirely open, entirely undefended, and what was on it was uncomplicated and total, and it was the thing that got Marin, the thing that made her blink twice and keep walking. The ceremony was short. The preacher said what needed saying. Gideon said his part in the steady, unadorned voice he used for things that were true. Marin said hers, and her voice held, and the words felt like things she was choosing rather than reciting. When it was done and the preacher said what the preacher says, Gideon took her face in his hands the same way he'd touched her cheek at the fence line in January. That same brief, careful touch. Except this time he didn't pull back and she didn't turn away. And Clara erupted from the front pew with a sound that was technically a cheer and attached herself to both of them simultaneously. And Lily came more slowly and put her arms around Marin's waist from one side and pressed her face into Marin's shoulder. And Marin put one arm around Lily and kept her other hand in Gideon's and stood there in the small Caldwell church with these three people who had become the shape of her life. She looked over Lily's head at the back of the church. Warren Holt was watching. When he saw her look at him, he gave a single nod. Not quite acknowledgement, not quite apology, something that lived in between. She nodded back. Then she looked at her husband and her daughters and let the rest of it go entirely. The reception was at the ranch house because Mrs. Aldine and three other women from the community had apparently organized this without consulting Marin, which she found out when the buckboard turned in at the gate and there were already people in the yard. The table from the kitchen had been moved to the porch, and there were plates, and someone had made a real cake, a layer cake with white icing, which Clara discovered with an enthusiasm that had to be physically managed. Marin stood on the porch of the house she had arrived at 6 months ago as a stranger, as a woman with nowhere left to go, and looked out at the flat Kansas land in the May afternoon and felt something she did not have a precise name for. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. It was bigger and quieter than happiness. It was something like arriving, like the sensation of putting down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing it was heavy. Gideon came to stand beside her. The noise of the small gathering continued around them and behind them. "You're somewhere else," he said. "No," she said. "I'm exactly here." He followed her gaze out across the ranch, the land, the barn, the fence lines he'd built, and she'd helped repair, the east pasture that had given them trouble all winter. He put his hand over hers on the porch railing, and she turned her hand over and held his. "The south gate latch is still broken," she said. "I'll fix it this week," he said. "You've been saying that since August," she said. "I'll fix it this week," he said again, with slightly more conviction. She looked at the south gate from where they stood. She thought about everything that had led to this porch, this afternoon, this hand, the train platform and the yellow dress, and $11.40. The narrow back room and the cold mornings and a pot of water spilled across the kitchen floor. A child with a too-tall mop, a braid tied with a ribbon, a letter about a dead woman that arrived 6 months late, a fever and a cut hand and a fence built in frozen ground with posts that were not entirely straight. "Leave it," she said. "I've gotten used to it." He looked at her sideways. "You've never once not mentioned it." "I know," she said. "That's different from not being used to it." He shook his head slightly, and the thing that pulled at his mouth was the full smile again. "Marin Mercer," he said, trying the name. "That's me," she said. It was the first time she'd heard it said aloud by him. She let it land and settle and become a real thing rather than an anticipated one, the way all real things needed a moment to become themselves. Inside, Clara had found the cake and the situation required adult intervention. Lily appeared in the doorway behind them and said, with the tone of a deputy reporting a developing crisis, "Papa, Clara." "How much has she eaten?" Gideon said. "Enough that you should come now," Lily said, "and not slowly." He looked at Marin. Marin looked at him. They went inside together. The south gate latch got fixed in June. Not by Gideon, by Marin, on a Tuesday afternoon when he was out with the cattle, and she had 40 minutes between the laundry and starting supper, and she found the replacement hardware he'd bought in May and never installed sitting on the workbench in the barn. She put it on herself, tested it 3 times, and said nothing about it at supper. He noticed the next morning. He came in from the early check on the horses and stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression she had learned to read, the one that meant he'd registered something and was deciding what to do with it. "The south gate," he said. "Fixed," she said, without looking up from the stove. A pause. "I was going to do that." "I know," she said. "Hand me that spoon." He handed her the spoon. He poured his coffee. He sat down at the table. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. That was the whole conversation, and it contained everything that needed to be said, which was one of the things about being married to Gideon Mercer that Marin had not anticipated, and was learning to value more than she could easily explain. He did not overstate. He did not perform gratitude or affection. When he felt something, it came out in the specific and economical way of a man who didn't have spare energy for decoration, and she had grown up in a world where people said large things that meant small things, and the reversal of this was still, 8 weeks into their marriage, something she noticed. She was not a perfect wife. She needed to be clear about this, at least to herself, Because the temptation after a hard road is to arrive somewhere and decide you've become someone better than you were, and Marin was too honest for that kind of revision. She had a short temper when she was tired, which on a ranch was often. She was not naturally warm with people she didn't know well, which made the social landscape of Caldwell more work than it might have been for someone else in her position. She had opinions about how things should be done, and she expressed them directly, which Gideon appreciated, and which certain members of the wider Caldwell community found forward for a woman who was relatively new to the territory. She also made mistakes with the girls that she had to repair, because being a mother, and she was using that word now, at least inside her own head, testing its weight, was not a skill she'd been taught, and she was assembling it from instinct and observation and occasional error. There was an evening in July when she corrected Clara harshly for something that did not warrant harshness, just impatience dressed up as correction, and Clara went quiet in the way she rarely did, and Marin knew immediately she'd gotten it wrong and had to sit with that knowledge through the rest of supper before she could do anything about it. After the girls were in bed, she went to Clara's room and sat on the edge of the bed and said, "I was short with you tonight, and I shouldn't have been." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Were you angry?" "I was tired," Marin said. "That's not an excuse. Tired is mine to manage, not yours to absorb." Clara thought about this with the visible effort she gave to things she was working to understand. "Papa says that too," she said, "that his moods are his to carry." "Your papa is right," Marin said. "He still has bad moods, though," Clara said. "He just carries them outside so we don't have to see." Marin looked at this child who noticed everything. "I'm sorry for tonight," she said. "I'll do better." Clara nodded with the gravity of someone accepting an apology on behalf of a committee. Then she said, "Can you do my braid in the morning, the way Lily likes, the one with the 2 pieces?" "Yes," Marin said. "Okay," Clara said, and lay back down, satisfied, the matter concluded. Marin sat on the edge of that bed for another moment after Clara's eyes closed, and she thought about her own mother. The distance of her, the way love in that house had been a thing you inferred rather than received, and she thought about what Lily had said in January, that Gideon had come back, all of him, and she understood that what Lily had been describing was presence, real presence, the kind that doesn't leave the room even when the body is still in it. She intended to be present. She was going to fail at it sometimes, because she was made of the same human material as everyone else who had failed at it before her. But she intended it completely, and she thought that intention, sustained and returned to even after the failures, was most of what love actually was in practice. The summer was hard in the way Kansas summers were hard, dry and hot and relentless, with a wind that didn't cool anything but simply moved the heat around. The cattle needed more attention, the water sources were low, and Gideon made the decision in August to sell a portion of the herd rather than carry them through what was shaping up to be a difficult fall. This was not a small decision. Marin knew it from the way he sat with it for 3 days before he said anything, and she gave him the 3 days without pressing because she had learned the shape of how he made hard decisions, and she respected it. When he told her, she listened completely. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" He looked at her across the table. "I need you to tell me if you think I'm wrong." "I don't think you're wrong," she said. "A smaller herd you can feed through a dry fall is better than a large herd you lose to it." "It sets us back from where I wanted to be," he said. "By spring, the numbers will recover," she said. "The cattle won't if we push them through a drought." He looked at her. "You've learned a lot in a year." "I've been paying attention," she said. "You're a good teacher when you're not trying to be one." Something crossed his face that was not quite amusement and not quite something else but lived between them. "I wasn't trying to teach you anything," he said. "I know," she said. "That's when it works best." He sold a third of the herd in September and the books, which Marin now kept with his knowledge and gradually with his full reliance, came out better than either of them had projected. Not good. Not yet. But not the hole they'd been standing next to the previous October when she'd found that feed invoice in the kitchen drawer. The mending income from town had stopped being necessary by summer, which was a specific satisfaction, not because the mending had been shameful, but because its absence meant they had crossed a line. The community had settled around Marin in the way communities settle around things that have proven themselves. Not dramatically, not with any formal acknowledgement, but with the shift in how people spoke to her and about her. Mrs. Aldine, who had become something close to a friend across the winter months, said to her in September over the counter of the dry goods store, "You've done well out there." And the way she said it was not a compliment to someone exceptional. It was a recognition of something established. Maren was not sure what she'd expected from belonging somewhere. She had not, honestly, expected to have it, which made the having of it strange to navigate. She'd spent so much of her life as the person who didn't quite fit, who was tolerated and sometimes found useful but not claimed, that membership in a community felt sometimes like wearing someone else's coat. It fit, and it was warm, but she was still occasionally surprised to look down and see it on her. She talked about this with Gideon on a September evening, which was the kind of conversation she could not have imagined having with anyone a year ago. He listened, which he always did, and then he said, "You think you have to keep earning it." She considered this. "Don't I?" "No more than anyone else does," he said. "The Hursts have been here 20 years, and Ed Hurst still worries every spring that the community will decide they don't need him. That's just what people do. It's not specific to you." "Ed Hurst is the most established rancher in the county," she said. "And he still brought 3 pies to the harvest gathering last month," Gideon said, "when one would have been sufficient." She looked at him. "Are you saying I should stop trying so hard?" "I'm saying you're already here," he said. "You've been here since January. Maybe let yourself know that." She sat with this. It was the most words he'd said at once about something internal in a while, and she recognized the weight of it, that he'd been thinking about this for her, in the way he thought about things, quietly and over time, and had waited until he had something worth saying. "You're sometimes wise," she told him, not reliably. He almost smiled. "I've been told." October arrived and brought with it the anniversary of something neither of them named directly, but both of them knew. 1 year since a train platform in Caldwell. 1 year since a man had walked past a woman with a worn trunk and no plan and offered to carry it because its latch was stuck. Maren woke on the 14th of October, the day, though she hadn't written it on any calendar, and lay in the gray early light before 4:45 and thought about who she had been 1 year ago on this date. She had been standing on that platform with her chin up and her hands trembling, and 16 months of letters folded in her coat and the specific, terrible, fragile belief that something was about to begin. Something had begun. Not the thing she'd planned, and not on the schedule she'd imagined, and not with the man she'd thought was waiting for her. It had begun beside a stuck trunk latch, with a man who didn't apologize for being 7 minutes late, and who would spend the next 12 months teaching her, without trying to, what it looked like when a person simply meant what they said. She got up and started the fire. Gideon came into the kitchen at 5 and stopped. There was a cake on the table. Not a grand cake. She had made it the previous evening after the girls were in bed, and it had leaned slightly to one side in the pan and the icing was uneven. But it was a cake, a real one, and there was a small bunch of late-season wildflowers in the tin cup next to it that she'd found at the edge of the east pasture yesterday and brought in on a hunch. He looked at the cake. He looked at her. "The 14th, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know you'd kept track." "Of course I kept track," she said. "Go wake the girls. Cake for breakfast seems appropriate." "That's going to ruin them," he said. "One morning," she said. "They'll survive." He went to wake the girls. Claire's response to the concept of cake for breakfast was everything Maren had expected. Lily came in more quietly, looked at the table, and then looked at Maren with an expression that said she understood more than she was going to articulate, which was very Lily. They ate cake at 5:30 in the morning, the 4 of them, in the Kansas October dark before the sun came up. The cake leaned and was slightly too sweet, and the icing was patchy, and it was the best breakfast Maren could remember in a long time, which had nothing to do with the cake and everything to do with the table it was sitting on. The pregnancy she noticed in November. She said nothing for 2 weeks because she was not certain, and because certainty felt important before she handed anyone else something to carry. When she was certain, she told Gideon on a Sunday evening after the girls were asleep, in the kitchen, directly. He went very still. She watched his face move through several things quickly. Surprise, and something that was almost fear, and then underneath both of those something that opened rather than closed. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He stood up from the table and came to her and put his arms around her, which was not his usual mode of expression and therefore meant more than it would have from a man who did it easily. She put her forehead against his shoulder and felt the solidness of him, the particular solidity of a person who stays. "I'm more than all right," he said, against her hair. "I need you to know it might be hard," she said. "I'm 32 and it's my first and I don't know." "I know," he said. "We'll manage it." "We don't always manage things perfectly," she said. "No," he agreed. "We manage them anyway." She pulled back and looked at him. His face was doing the thing it did when he was feeling something large and was holding it with both hands. "The girls," she said. "The girls will be—" he started. "I know they'll be fine," she said. "I want to tell them together, tomorrow morning." "Cake for breakfast again?" he said. "Don't push it," she said. They told the girls the next morning over regular oatmeal, which was a disappointment to Clara on principle until the content of the announcement redirected her entirely. Clara's reaction was immediate and comprehensive and involved standing on her chair, which she was told to get down from, and a series of questions delivered at rapid speed about the logistics of babies that Maren answered as honestly as she could, and Gideon handled the rest. Lily's reaction was different. She sat with the information for a long moment, while Clara ricocheted around her, and then she looked at Maren with her direct, careful eyes. "Will you be safe?" she said. The question landed in a specific place. Maren understood what Lily was really asking, and what she was afraid of, and where that fear came from. She reached across the table and put her hand over Lily's. "I intend to be," she said. "I'm going to do everything right, and I need you and Clara to be my helpers, which means I need you healthy and present and not frightening yourselves." Lily looked at their hands. Then she looked up. "I'll help," she said. "Clara will help too, even if she breaks things doing it." "I won't break anything," Clara said, from across the kitchen where she had migrated. "You break something every week," Lily said, with the patience of long experience. "Accidentally," Clara said. "Accidents don't count." The winter was gentler than the previous one, which was either luck or climate, or the particular mercy that sometimes arrives in a life that has been paying attention. Maren's pregnancy was not easy. She was tired in a way she had not known tiredness before. A deep cellular tiredness that had nothing to do with how much sleep she got, and there were weeks in December and January when the cold and the fatigue together produced a version of herself she did not entirely like. She was short-tempered sometimes. She needed help with things she was used to doing alone, which was the hardest part, the asking, the accepting. She asked, she accepted. These were skills she was building from scratch at 32, but she was building them. Gideon took on more of the household work without being asked, and without making a production of it, which was the correct approach, and she told him so. He said he'd watched her do the ranch work for a year, and he knew most of it by now, which was not an entirely accurate statement, but was said with such deadpan confidence that she let it stand. Lily braided her hair every morning through the whole winter, which had inverted their original dynamic in a way neither of them commented on, but both of them felt. Clara made a specific point of reading aloud to Maren in the evenings while Maren rested, a task she undertook with dramatic commitment and significant embellishment of the original texts, which the books did not require, but which was very Clara. The boy was born in June. He was born at the Mercer Ranch with Mrs. Aldine in attendance and Gideon present, and the girls down the hall in their room, technically asleep but audibly not. He was born after a labor that was long and hard and honest, and when it was over, Maren was exhausted in a way she thought might be permanent, and also, simultaneously, more awake than she'd ever been in her life. Gideon held him first, because Maren's arms were shaking. She watched her husband hold this small person, this person who was both of them, and neither of them, and entirely himself. And she saw on Gideon's face something she had never seen there before. Not the steady competence, not the contained feeling, not even the full open smile from the wedding. Something more fundamental than all of those. Something that looked like a man discovering a room in himself he didn't know was there. "He needs a name," Maren said. Her voice was hoarse. "I know," Gideon said, not looking up from the baby. "We talked about names," she said. "I know. You like Thomas." "I do. I like James." "I know that too." He looked up at her finally. His eyes were bright in a way she was going to pretend she didn't see, for his dignity. "Thomas James," he said. "Both." She looked at her son in her husband's arms. "Thomas James Mercer," she said, trying it. That's a serious name, Gideon said, for someone who currently weighs about as much as a small cat. He'll grow into it, she said. He brought the baby to her and she held him, and the shaking in her arms steadied without her deciding it to, the way bodies know things before minds do. Thomas James Mercer looked up at her with the unfocused gaze of the newborn, not seeing her exactly, not yet, but present in her arms, warm and breathing and entirely real. Mrs. Aldean opened the door quietly and said she'd tell the girls they could come in for a moment, and Clara came in first at a speed that was only barely contained and stopped 2 feet from the bed, with her hands clasped and her face incandescent, and Lily came behind her and stopped at the doorway first, looking from the bed to Marin and back again, assessing. "He's small," Clara breathed. "Babies are small," Lily said, coming closer. She looked at Thomas with an expression that was measuring and careful, and then slowly became something else. "He looks like Papa," she said. "Around the eyes," Marin agreed. "He's going to be loud," Clara predicted. "Probably," Marin said. "I was a loud baby," Clara said. "Papa told me." "Papa would know," Marin said. Lily reached out and touched the baby's hand with one careful finger, and Thomas's fingers, by the pure reflex of the newborn, closed around it. Lily went absolutely still. She looked at this small hand holding her finger, and she looked at Marin, and she did not try to manage her expression at all. And Marin saw on Lily Mercer's face, for the first time in the 2 years she had known her, something completely unguarded. Not the contained acceptance or the careful assessment or the watchful love she parceled out slowly and seriously. Just wonder, plain and total. "Oh," Lily said softly. "Yeah," Marin said. The years that followed were not simple. Marin never expected them to be, and was grateful for that expectation, because it meant she met the difficulties as facts rather than betrayals. Thomas was, as Clara had predicted, loud, a vigorous and opinionated child who walked early and talked earlier and had his father's stubbornness and his mother's habit of looking at something from every available angle before deciding anything. He and Clara were natural conspirators from the time he was old enough to conspire, and the combination of their energies required a level of adult vigilance that was both exhausting and privately hilarious. Lily grew into herself in the way that serious children sometimes do, not by softening, but by finding more room inside her own seriousness. She had a gift with the horses that emerged early and developed steadily, and by the time she was 12, she was better with the difficult ones than anyone on the ranch, including Gideon, who acknowledged this without ceremony and gave her full responsibility accordingly. She was not a demonstrative girl. She became a not demonstrative young woman who expressed love through presence and attention and the occasional perfectly timed silence, which Marin recognized as a familiar language. Clara, at 14, decided she wanted to be a teacher. She announced this at supper with the authority of someone who had thought about it long enough that debate was unnecessary. Marin looked at this girl, this young woman, she corrected herself, which happened more often now, who had held a too-tall mop out to a stranger on a kitchen floor and said it happens all the time with such uncalculating kindness, and thought that teaching was exactly right for her. She said so. Clara accepted this affirmation and immediately began making plans that outpaced any reasonable timeline, which was also exactly right for her. The ranch found its footing in the way that things find their footing when you refuse to let them fall. Not elegantly, not without setback, but steadily. A good cattle year in 1890 cleared the remaining debt that had been sitting in the back of Marin's account book since before she arrived. She noted this to Gideon on the evening she entered the final numbers, and he looked at the page for a long moment and said nothing, and she understood that he was feeling something he didn't have words for, and she didn't need him to find them. "We're clear," she said. "Fully." He put his hand over hers on the account book. "Yeah," he said. The neighbors knew them now as the Mercer operation. Gideon's good judgment with the cattle, Marin's management of the accounts, and the household, and the particular social intelligence that Gideon had never had and had stopped pretending to attempt. People came to them for things now, which was still strange to Marin. A neighboring family with a sick child in the middle of the night. A young wife who had come out from the east on a mail order arrangement, not unlike Marin's own, frightened and uncertain, who someone had thought to send to the Mercer place because of Marin specifically. Marin sat with this young woman for 3 hours one November afternoon and gave her not comfort exactly, but something more useful, The plain truth of her own first weeks, the specific texture of how hard it was, and that hard was not the same as wrong. The young woman stayed. Maren heard from her regularly after that, which she found she valued in a way she hadn't expected. She had not, for most of her life, been the kind of person other people sought out. The experience of being sought was still new enough to be noticed. She was 38 when Lily married. The wedding was at the ranch, which Lily chose because she was not a church and ceremony person, which everyone who knew her had known since approximately age 4. The man she married was a quiet, horse-minded young rancher from 20 miles east who had understood from their first meeting that Lily would not be managed or hurried, and had responded to this by simply being patient, which Maren recognized as wisdom. She stood with Gideon during the ceremony and watched her daughter, Dora's daughter, hers, both of these things true and not in conflict, speak her vows with the directness and certainty she brought to every true thing, and she felt the years sitting in her chest, all of them, the difficult ones and the ordinary ones and the ones she would not have traded for anything. Gideon put his hand at the small of her back during the ceremony, the old familiar gesture, and she leaned slightly against it without thinking. "She looks like Dora," he said quietly, for her alone. "Around the eyes," Maren said. "Around the whole of it," he said, and his voice had something in it that she let him have privately. At the reception, which went long into the evening because people were happy and the night was warm, and Kansas could be generous in summer, Maren found a moment to stand alone at the edge of the yard. Not far. She could hear Clara's voice from inside, telling someone a story with too much detail and perfect timing, and Thomas's laugh, and Gideon talking to Lily's new husband in the tone he used when he was assessing someone and beginning to approve. She looked out past the yard to the land, the ranch in the evening light, the fence line she knew as well as her own hands, the south gate with its latch that worked correctly, the barn where she had first gone alone in the cold to move cattle that ended up in the wrong pasture, the porch where she had stood on the afternoon of her own wedding and felt the weight lift. She thought about the train platform. She thought about Warren Holt's back. She thought about $11.40 and a stuck trunk latch, and a man who was 7 minutes late without apology, and who had offered her not pity but a practical problem, a trunk, a wagon, a direction. She had been afraid on that platform. She had been more afraid when she got in the buckboard, and more afraid when she met 2 small girls at a fence gate, and more afraid when she lay in a narrow back room and listened to the wind and told herself she was being sensible. She had been afraid at the kitchen table when Gideon said stay, and she had been afraid on the fence line in January when she'd said yes, and she had been afraid when she held Thomas for the first time and felt her own arms shaking. Fear had not been the obstacle. Fear had been present at every important moment of her life here, which she had come to understand meant fear was not a signal to stop, but simply a signal that something real was happening. This was the thing she had told the young woman from the east, sitting at the kitchen table in November. Not that it wouldn't be frightening. That frightening was frequently the shape that real took. Gideon came to stand beside her. He had a way of finding her when she went still, which she'd noticed early and had never mentioned because some things you hold as evidence without needing to present them. "Clara is telling the story about the biscuits," he said. "Which version?" Maren said. "The one where she's a culinary artist misunderstood by her era. The horse biscuit." "The horse biscuit," he confirmed. She smiled. The evening air moved, warm and dry. From inside came the sound of laughter at something Clara had said, and it was Clara's laugh too, which meant she was laughing at herself, which was the best version of her. "What are you thinking?" Gideon said. She looked at the land, at the fence lines and the barn and the south gate and the east pasture and the whole accumulated fact of this life. At the 17 years of mornings at 4:45 and the account books cleared and the braid she'd tied with one ribbon on a cold January morning for a girl who'd needed someone to do it right. "I'm thinking that the worst thing that ever happened to me," she said, turned out to be the first thing. He was quiet beside her. He understood what she meant. He understood most of what she meant, most of the time, which was a thing she had stopped taking for granted early on and had never started again. "Warren Holt is farming wheat up near Dodge City," he said. "Someone told me at the feed store last week." "Good for him," she said, and meant it without irony, which was something it had taken her a few years to get to and which she was proud of. "You really don't hold on to it," he said. "I don't know if I could do that." "I held on to it for a while," she said. "It was heavy. Things that are heavy and serve no purpose should be put down." She paused. Also, the life I have is hard to stay bitter in. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into it, into the specific familiar weight of him, and they stood at the edge of their yard in the Kansas summer evening with the sounds of their family behind them and the wide frontier dark ahead, and the stars came out the way they always did out here. Not one or two, but all of them at once, too many to count, the whole extravagant, unnecessary abundance of them. She had been 31 years old with nowhere to go, and she had made somewhere to go from the material available, which was imperfect and cold and financially troubled and staffed by two children who had been testing her since the first morning. She had made it by showing up at 4:45 and doing the work, and saying the true things, even when the true things were hard to say, and by learning, slowly and with difficulty, to stop waiting for something to be taken from her and start letting herself have it. This was not a lesson she had learned all at once. It was more like the fence they'd built in frozen ground, not entirely straight, requiring maintenance, holding because they kept making it hold. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, she had come to understand, the only kind of thing that lasted. Not the perfect or the handed down or the arrived at easily, but the built, the tended, the chosen again, every ordinary morning before the sun came up. The laughter from inside the house rose and fell. Thomas said something loud and Clara answered him, and Lily's voice came through underneath both of them, quiet and certain. Gideon's arm was solid around her shoulders, and the stars were doing what they always did, indifferent and abundant. The same stars that had been over that train platform in October of 1887 when a woman with $11.40 had put her chin up and looked for a face she thought was waiting for her. A different face had been waiting. She just hadn't known it yet. She knew it now.